Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Ange Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 3 trade targets for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about 4 running backs and 4 wide receiver prospects that are all currently buy low candidates. Besides the fact that they've all produced under their overall projections, and in fact, probably aggravated a lot of fantasy managers, I think these players have incredible potential for the rest of the 2021 fantasy football season, which is why we evaluated them and drafted them as early as we did. We'll talk about 8 prospects and give you guys my perspective and analysis and the statistics that justify my reasoning as to why you should be buying low on these 4 players. Of course, giving us more depth at the running back and wide receiver position, because again, we all know how difficult that is to acquire over a year throughout the waiver wire, and go after players that will eventually be extremely hard to acquire via trade. I mean, after these players, these running backs and receivers have their breakout performances, it'll require one of your blue chip players to acquire them in return. And at that point, it probably won't even be worth the trade. So you want to go ahead and grab them now before we get into Week 3, and of course they have their breakout performances potentially even this week or in weeks to come. Now, before we begin today's video, I want to thank you guys for the incredible support. If you guys haven't yet already and you're new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We're going to be making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2021 fantasy football season, whether it is trade target videos, strength of schedule for the upcoming season, rest of season rankings, regular weekly rankings, the waiver wire videos, the Sunday morning live streams, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, kickoff with Kirchhoff, helping you set your lineups for the given week, and of course trying to overall help you win a 2021 fantasy football championship. So if you're interested in that, make sure you subscribe. For those of you who are already subscribed and supporting on the daily, I do appreciate you guys a lot. Thank you very much. Make sure you smash that like button down below, and of course go down to the comment section. Let me know what other prospects other than the ones that I'm going to mention today should be sought after, other guys that we should potentially be trading for right now before they have their breakout performances. Thank you very much. All right, outside of that, down in the description we do have my Patreon link for those of you who are interested in the benefits there. Besides all of your 2021 fantasy football questions answered, weekly rankings, all of that expanded. You can check that out if you're interested in supporting there. Also, we have timestamps in the description. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into this, shall we? Because we've got 4 players at the running back position that I certainly want to get into, beginning with the number 1 prospect here. We have Jonathan Taylor. Now, Jonathan Taylor, as of this current moment in time in a half PPR scoring format, is the number 28 overall running back. That's far below where we drafted him, because in many leagues, he was taken in the first round and not by accident. Of course, behind one of the better offensive lines in the National Football League. And the performance that he had at the back end of the 2020 season, of course, gave us a lot of confidence to go ahead and invest in him going into 2021, because he was only going to get better. Now, of course, thus far this season, he has been lackluster, 3.3 yards per carry, has not scored a touchdown, and has a total of only 20.4 fantasy points. As a whole, it's not great, but there are some specific statistics that give me the confidence to go ahead and invest in Jonathan Taylor and try to bring him over to my team, because I know going forward, he is going to find success. Now, the number 1 statistic is opportunity. Opportunity leads to success in fantasy football, and that's definitely the case for the running back position. Now, when we think about the opportunity that Jonathan Taylor has already been given thus far this season, 32 rushing attempts and a total of 8 targets leading to 7 receptions. So, 40 total opportunities, about 20 per game, and 39 total touches. As of this current moment in time, that is fantastic. We'll take that for any running back, much less a guy that, yes, may be underperforming, but the opportunity is there. And as long as opportunity is going to continue to go in his direction, of course, he's eventually going to find those touchdowns. He's eventually going to be able to get in. I mean, in terms of opportunity down in the red zone, thus far this season, he has had 6 rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line and 9 total touches inside the 10-yard line. So, of course, those are eventually going to lead to touchdowns. And if and when they do, he's going to get back to being an RB1 on a weekly basis. I mean, there's a reason why he finished as the number 6 overall running back in half PPR last season, while of course being a rookie and not really finding much success early on until he eventually found himself at the back end of the season. So when we think about the potential of Jonathan Taylor and what we've already seen in the past and the opportunity he's currently getting, I want to go ahead and reiterate how important opportunity is and how often it leads to success at the running back position. There's a statistic and a couple lines of research that I went ahead and did for my 2021 fantasy football draft guide. I'll go ahead and kind of reintroduce some of these excerpts for those of you guys who didn't have that or weren't able to go ahead and read that this offseason. Of the last decade of football, we have seen 71 running backs finish with 20 touches per game on average, minimum of 10 games played within that season. 71 running backs only in the last decade who have averaged 20 touches per game. Now, with that being said, Of those 71 running backs, 60 of them finished as RB1s in their respective seasons. That's 84.5% of the time. Nearly 85% of the time, players that have gotten 20 touches per game have finished as RB1s in their respective seasons. Of those 60 players who have become RB1s, 44 of them have finished as top 12 flex players, whether that is running back, wide receiver, or tight end, kind of all in an amalgamation, just to kind of separate themselves from one another. So as a whole, that would be 62% of the group, with 44 out of those 71. Getting touches at this volume is extremely rare, and the value that you have at the running back position when you're touching the ball this often is unbelievable. In fact, since 2016, running backs that have averaged over 20 touches per game, that accounts for 35 separate performances, those running backs have averaged 18 fantasy points per game. Jonathan Taylor has a lot of potential. And of course, the opportunity is certainly going to be there. And as long as he gets that opportunity, it's going to lead to success. I mean, the main difference of whether or not Jonathan Taylor explodes is obviously, is he going to get the passing work? Is he going to get the goal line touches? And is he going to be on the field? And majority of the time, the answers are yes to all three of those. I mean, in week 1, we saw him 7 targets, 6 receptions, 60 receiving yards. The receiving work, regardless of whether Nyheim Hines is there, is going to continue to exist. On top of it, we've already talked about his red zone rushing attempts. The touchdowns are going to get there and the opportunities are going to get there. And he's going to be on the field, even with Marlon Mack getting more touches in this last week. The statistic that in 2020 pretty much defined Jonathan Taylor was when Jonathan Taylor played 50% or more of the offensive snaps, he averaged 20.45 fantasy points per game and 21.87 touches per game. All in all, I think Jonathan Taylor has an incredible upcoming schedule, and on top of it is the entire offense for this team. I know Carson Wentz is practicing today, and yes, he is working on 2 sprained ankles, but they're going to have to rely upon this running game that much more as we progress through the season. You get left tackle Eric Fisher back. I know he's coming off of an Achilles injury, formerly of the Kansas City Chiefs. He's a good offensive lineman. You bring him into this offense, obviously replacing Anthony Costanzo of the past, you're going to find a lot of success. I know Nelson, the left guard, all-pro himself, has been dealing with his foot injury, had surgery just a couple weeks back. It wasn't that long ago that we thought Nelson wouldn't even be playing at the beginning of the season, much less he's back and ready to go. If the first couple weeks of the 2021 fantasy football season have taught us anything about Jonathan Taylor, it's that the opportunity is going to be there, and we know that the talent is certainly there. It's just only a matter of time until he breaks out, and I want to go ahead and make sure he's on my roster before he goes ahead and does so. So why not go buy low on Jonathan Taylor? The next prospect I wanted to mention is another second-year running back, Antonio Gibson. Antonio Gibson finished the 2020 season as the number 12 overall back in a half PPR scoring format, even with the fact that he dealt with injuries late in the season and didn't even get the full starting spot until a couple weeks into the season. Though Antonio Gibson was dealt a bad hand in 2020 at times, he really did have incredible performances that separated him from the pack. I mean, the fact that he was able to score 11 touchdowns in 2020 in an offense that really had a rotating quarterback position, it was quite surprising. But for many of us who invested in Antonio Gibson last year, we know exactly what his potential is. I mean, in the games last year that he played at least 37% of the offensive snaps, he averaged 15.36 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format and was averaging about 16.36 touches per game. As of thus far this season, the touches have been there, the receiving work has been there, and a lot of people are getting concerned about the potential of Antonio Gibson because he currently sits as the number 29 overall back, only one spot behind Jonathan Taylor. But I still think that there's a lot of potential to see from Antonio Gibson, and though we haven't seen incredible production because the touchdowns haven't been there, and J.D. McKissic is coming off of the buzz of that Thursday night game in which he stole the red zone touchdown and got a lot of work in the passing game, I think those are things that we don't really have to worry about. In week 1 of this season, he had 20 rushing attempts, 5 targets, 3 receptions, 4.5 yard per carry average. Yes, he fumbled late in the game, which pretty much lost him the game, but he wasn't being punished from that in week 2. Week 2, 13 rushing attempts for 69 rushing yards, a 5.3 yard per carry average, 2 targets, 2 receptions. Great, the opportunity is there. But now you may be wondering, why is J.D. McKissic being utilized as much in this offense? And should it be concerning me going forward? When I looked at what J.D. McKissic did the other night, yes, it was impressive. It was great, but it was mainly a game plan integration for the Washington football team. Now, let me go ahead and explain. When we looked at what the Washington football team did in 2020 against the New York Giants, both the times that they played against them, Antonio Gibson had some of his worst games, in fact. He put up 7.5 fantasy points and 11 fantasy points, and in both of those games had himself 9 touches and 13 touches. Of course, the opportunity wasn't there, and the fantasy point production wasn't there. Similar to this season, in which he only had 15 touches, a little bit of an upscale, obviously, because he's more familiar with the offense, and they're ready to go ahead and commit to him, and was only able to put up 8.3 points against the New York Giants. But J.D. McKissic, in fact, had himself a fantastic game against the New York Giants this year, and was utilized a lot in the same matchup last season. Last season in the 2 games against the New York Giants, 14 touches and 12 touches. Sounds a lot similar like this year, in which he had 9 touches, leading to, of course, last season, 11.4 fantasy points and 12.7 fantasy points. I personally believe, by far and away, Antonio Gibson is the best running back in this backfield. I know the organization believes that, and I know for a fact that based on what we've seen in terms of snap share, and the integration of J.D. McKissic specifically in the matchup against the New York Giants, it was a game plan integration that we're going to get J.D. McKissic more involved because they knew they were going to have to pass a lot. And that J.D. McKissic gives them the best overall advantage when you have a running back out of the backfield that's going to be able to contribute as much in the passing game in that close of a matchup that was relatively a shootout. So as of this current moment in time, I'm not worried about Antonio Gibson. The fact that he's been able to touch the ball 33 times on the ground this season, and he's gotten himself 5 receptions, 38 total touches in 40 opportunities. Like I mentioned, similar to Jonathan Taylor, when we talk about opportunity leading to success, if you're going to average about 20 total opportunities per game, obviously a little bit less because the receiving total isn't as high, I think it's obviously going to eventually lead to success. Those touchdowns are going to get there. It's just a matter of time. It's a matter of waiting. And if you can invest in Antonio Gibson now, I think it'll pay dividends in the future. We move on to the next running back I wanted to mention. It is Saquon Barkley. Now, there are a couple stipulations before we talk about Saquon Barkley and investing in him and as to the reasons why. Saquon Barkley should only be approached if, in fact, you can afford to go ahead and maybe even bench him for 2 more weeks. As of thus far this season, we've seen very little utilization of Saquon Barkley out of this backfield and very little production. Yes, in comparison to other running backs, getting 11 rushing attempts in week 1 and 13 rushing attempts in week 2 may be great. But for Saquon Barkley, we expect him to touch the ball 25 times a game and get a lot of utilization in the passing game because he's an incredible receiving back. But we haven't seen that this season. And that's why I wanted to preface, you should only go after him if you're willing to wait 2 more weeks because we don't know exactly when he is going to be fully healthy. If you guys remember this offseason, the main report that made Saquon Barkley slide in terms of ADP was that the organization was considering maybe him not even playing week 1, and they didn't know, and he didn't know whether he was going to be 100% within the first 4 weeks of the season. We knew that there were reports out there by many beat writers for the New York Giants that said he may not be fully healthy and fully utilized for the first month of the season. And that's pretty much exactly what we've seen. So they haven't been lying. And in fact, it gives me more confidence to potentially even invest in Saquon now because last week, Thursday Night Football, on a short week, played about 85% of the offensive snaps, touched the ball 13 times on the ground, had himself a huge 30-plus yard run. Those things excite me. And I think the potential of going after Saquon Barkley because of all the talent that we know that he's capable of and the offense that, of course, needs to run the ball. Yes, their offensive line has dealt with a couple injuries as of late, but I still think there's a lot of potential for Saquon Barkley. We know what he's capable of. I mean, this is a guy that in his rookie year was a top 3 overall running back. When you're able to do that, we know what kind of potential you have. So it's just a matter of whether he can get back in time and whether you as a fantasy team have the correct roster construction to be able to afford trading for him and may not even be able to use him in the coming weeks because he may not be 100%. And if you can wait on that and then you can eventually get 95, 98% of Saquon Barkley, then as the second half of the season begins, you're going to find yourself with 100% Saquon Barkley and 100% of a fantastic trade that you made early in the season. That is why I believe you should be going after Saquon Barkley because as of right now, he may not be 100%, but he's going to eventually get there. We move on to our number 4 and the last running back that I wanted to mention. Another player that I want to preface something before. I think as of this current moment in time, considering Clyde Edwards-Helaire is the number 48 overall running back and he's only put up 11 points in half PPR fantasy, you can buy him for dirt cheap. You can go right now and buy him for pretty much pennies on the dollar because fantasy managers must be aggravated. They must be so pissed off that they're just ready to sell him. Just get him off my hands. And if that's the case and you're able to go and buy him for cheap, I think this may be an option in which you can go ahead, grab him, bring him to your team, and flip him. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? We have seen Clyde Edwards-Helaire, even last season, in the beginning of the year, find a lot of opportunity in this offense. In fact, from weeks 1 through 6 of the 2020 season, he was averaging 21.33 touches per game, and was averaging 14.12 fantasy points per game, while only scoring 1 touchdown in that 6-week basis. Now, besides the fact that he was getting a lot of opportunity on the ground, the air production was unbelievable. I mean, the guy had 31 targets within those first 6 games, which was, 5 targets per game. And throughout that time, Clyde Edwards-Helaire was the number 11 overall running back in half PPR fantasy, and we believed in him. And for those of you who invested in him early last season, you found the potential that we were looking for. Unfortunately, eventually he got injured. They brought in, Le'Veon Bell, and his production went down into the ground. Now this season, we haven't seen 5 targets per game. We've seen only 3 targets in the first 2 games, which is horrendous. We haven't seen those 21 touches per game, as he's only touched the ball 13 and 14 times on the ground in the first 2 games. That kind of production obviously isn't great, but I think it's going to turn around. I think this offense is going to have to eventually run the ball. And if and when they take leads and they need to kill clock, they got to put in Clyde Edwards-Helaire. They got to get him back on track. And why not do it against the Los Angeles Chargers? I mean, the Los Angeles Chargers matchup this upcoming week is an advantageous one. I mean, we really just saw Zeke and Tony Pollard both run for over 70 yards, both run for a touchdown, and rendered Dak Prescott as a bystander in that matchup. But, Dak Prescott literally didn't throw a touchdown, but had an 85% passing completion percentage because the entire game plan was just run the ball and just run it down their throat. And that's what they did successfully. So hopefully this upcoming week, if you can buy him for dirt cheap, go ahead, bring him onto your roster and maybe flip him and then send him back to someone else in another week. Another trade target and potentially sell target in the coming weeks, just in case. All right, we can move on from the running back position and begin talking about our wide receiver trade targets. The first one is DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. I think DK Metcalf is absolutely a trade target because of how much potential we've seen from him and just what he's been capable of doing. Yes, this season he scored a touchdown, had 1 good game, but this last week was really just underwhelming. And maybe fantasy managers in your league are looking to dump him off and are thinking, man, Tyler Lockett is dominating that offense, but a lot of people don't remember. Tyler Lockett comes out of every season in the beginning and is immediately on fire, and then eventually will fall off, have his every now and then fluctuation games. And though the target counts are there for Tyler Lockett, we've only seen 16 targets go in the direction of DK Metcalf. And I think that number is only going to increase in the coming weeks. Now, when we look at the statistics and the capabilities of DK Metcalf just from last season, the guy averaged 14.36 fantasy points per game. In the 16 games that he played, 10 of those games consisted of 8+ targets. And when he's been targeted 8 or more times in a game, he's averaged 17.4 fantasy points throughout his career. On top of that, last season, had 5 games of 100 receiving yards, 10 total touchdowns. And to be honest, when I think about what he is capable of this upcoming season, he's only getting better. This is only his 3rd year in the National Football League. Let's not kind of overlook that. Now, yes, Tyler Lockett has certainly overshadowed him in terms of production, but Tyler Lockett's also had extra opportunities in terms of the aspects that DK Metcalf thrives in, the deep ball. As of thus far this season, Tyler Lockett has had 7 targets of over 20 yards that have led to 4 receptions and 3 receiving touchdowns, while DK Metcalf has had 3 targets and only 1 reception for 0 touchdowns. Now, when we go back to last season, look how just incredible DK Metcalf was. Even going back to his rookie year from 2019, DK Metcalf has led all wide receivers with end zone targets, 32 of them, number 1 in the league since 2019, and has had the most receptions of 30 or more yards. I believe the rest of this upcoming season is going to be an incredible year for DK Metcalf. We just got to get there. And many fantasy managers might not be able to wait. Maybe they're already 0-2 and they're looking down the barrel of becoming 0-3. And they don't want to be put into that situation, because if you play in a league in which there's 12 teams and only 6 make the playoffs, if you're starting 0-3, you're going to have to win 8 of the next, maybe 9 of the next 11 games after that. And at that point, that's pretty unlikely. So many teams may be looking to just ship DK Metcalf. And if in fact they're willing to do so, I'm 100% willing to buy, because I know the potential. And I know eventually Russell Wilson's going to be looking for him in the deep game, and he's certainly going to be able to pop off. And once, in fact, he does, he's going to be hard to trade for. I think that may be this upcoming week, considering where I have him ranked in my overall wide receiver rankings. But DK should have a great overall season, and that's why we should be going out and buying him right now. Move on to A.J. Brown, a teammate of DK Metcalf. Certainly enough, both of these guys have not produced up to their overall projections. But, A.J. Brown is kind of the surprising one because he has been a touchdown fiend since Ryan Tannehill has kind of taken over this Tennessee Titans offense. In fact, in the 24 games that they played with each other in 2019 through 2020, we saw incredible production from A.J. Brown. Besides the fact that he was averaging 14.88 total fantasy points per game. In terms of fantasy points per game last season, he was number 5 amongst all wide receivers. If he had played a full 2020 season with his averages, the guy would have been a top 6 overall wide receiver. Now, besides that point, yes, we know that A.J. Brown is not a guy that's going to get himself 8+ targets a game. Though, thus far this season, he has seen his target count increase heavily in comparisons to years past. When we look at his averages, when A.J. Brown has been targeted 5 or more times in his career, he's averaged 17.03 fantasy points per game. There's a lot of potential with a wide receiver like this, and in my opinion, he certainly shouldn't be slept on. I know that the Tennessee Titans offense has looked horrible, mainly because Ryan Tannehill hasn't played well, the offensive line hasn't played well, and they're just trying to adjust to this new offensive coordinator. But if and when they do, A.J. Brown is going to be a huge play, and every single week has the threat of not only scoring 1 touchdown, going for 100 yards, but scoring even more because he'll have Julio Jones on the other side of the field pulling pressure. And yes, in comparison to Corey Davis last season, Julio will see more targets, but ultimately this offense is probably going to have to pass more. There's a reason why Derrick Henry has already caught himself, half as many passes as he caught last season. The amount of opportunity we're seeing this team kind of distribute through the passing game is going to be far more than last year. Ryan Tannehill only threw the ball 481 times last season, and now he's on pace to potentially throw the ball 600 times this year. There is going to be more targets for A.J. Brown. There's going to be more potential for him, and I think in the coming weeks, when they click, especially in a matchup this upcoming week against a division rival like the Indianapolis Colts, I think this is the breakout week, and this is why you have to trade for him right now. Move on to our number 3. We have Robert Woods, a guy that is near and dear to my heart, but Robert Woods has looked a lot like Bobby Trees, and I've talked about this in the past. Bobby Trees is his, alternate personality, alter ego when he starts playing bad, and I don't want to see any more Bobby Trees, and I think we're going to see a little bit of a turnaround, but I think Robert Woods is very similar to Clyde Edwards-Helaire as a guy that I want to go ahead and grab to flip. I don't want to have to rely upon Robert Woods for the rest of this upcoming season because I've seen how much Matthew Stafford prefers to throw the ball to Cooper Kupp, and with that, it makes me think, okay, as long as I can get Robert Woods onto my team for relatively cheap because he's done nothing thus far this season. 20.4 fantasy points, 8 total receptions from 91 yards, 1 receiving touchdown. All right, but really he is a guy that you want to buy low and immediately get a great performance out of him this upcoming weekend and sell him. Now, the reason why I mentioned that is because they play against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. In the last 2 games that he's played against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the first one in 2019, 13 catches, 164 yards, 22.9 fantasy points. And in 2020, 12 receptions, 130 yards and a touchdown, 24.6 fantasy points. There's a lot of potential for Robert Woods to have a great game this upcoming week in Los Angeles against the defending champs. And if the Los Angeles Rams want to air it out, I think it's a great option, especially with Darrell Henderson hurt, to grab a wide receiver that can not only serve in the short term, but maybe even be flipped and get yourself another investment down the line. And that is why I wanted to mention Robert Woods. The last wide receiver option I want to mention is someone that may not be as widely available in terms of people who drafted Michael Thomas know what they're doing. If you drafted Michael Thomas, you know that you're investing in the right overall prospect because eventually when he comes back and he's eligible to return after week 7, once in fact he does, he's going to be the number 1 receiving option of this team. When I look at the target count that Jameis Winston has distributed in this New Orleans Saints offense, it's terrible. Alvin Kamara is the leading receiver with 7 overall receptions in 2 games with 10 targets. That's not great. The wide receiver position for the New Orleans Saints, the 3 leading receivers in terms of receptions are Callaway, Harris, and Hogan, and they all have 3 receptions. That's terrible. They've liked to distribute the ball out to different receiving options, but there isn't an established number 1 guy. And when Michael Thomas gets there, I can assure you that he's certainly going to be that guy. We all know what a healthy Michael Thomas looks like. It just was a couple seasons ago where he had the most receptions in NFL history. He broke Marvin Harrison's record. And if he's currently on a roster with a manager that may be 1-1 or 0-2 and is looking down the barrel of losing a couple games in the next coming weeks and they can't afford to keep Michael Thomas on roster, go ahead, throw out an offer. Bring them into your team if in fact you are prepared to potentially not sit him for the next 4 or 5 weeks until he returns. Maybe he misses even more time. But if you have a solidified enough roster, similar to the Saquon Barkley scenario that I've painted, if you have a solidified enough roster with a great overall construction and depth, then why not go ahead and invest in Michael Thomas, who could very easily be a wide receiver 1 once he returns, because the opportunity is certainly going to be there, as his team will be throwing for a majority of the time, considering how they've performed this season. I think there's a lot of potential in this prospect, and if you already have him on roster, hold tight, because eventually he's going to show up and he's going to ball out. These are my week 3 trade targets for the 2021 fantasy football season. Thank you everybody for watching. I'll be talking about trade targets, guys, to go after every now and again. I obviously don't want to mention it every single week, because eventually we will see players like the ones on screen have breakout performances. And if and when they do, we'll look for other guys that haven't, potentially produced up to their expectations, and we'll go after them. But hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video. Smash that like button if you did. Tomorrow we will be, of course, talking about some must-start players for Week 3 of the 2021 fantasy football season. 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Do not forget to be there. Kick off with Kirchhoff, helping you set your lineups. Thank you once again. Until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.